Thank you, Ruti, for presiding over this panel, and I want to thank the organizer for making this workshop happen. I feel greatly privileged to be able to participate from all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. I want to focus today on an empirical puzzle that led certain scholars to define a certain type of political action as post-ideological. In order to understand this puzzle, I will offer a little background on the concept of prefigurative politics and on its developments. And then I will offer some empirical evidence to suggest that the post-ideological argument may be misplaced. So in recent decades, we saw a series of protest movements that center around a common call for reforming the democratic system in favor of more decentralized, participatory, and autonomous political forms. What is unique about these movements, such as the Occupy Wall Street or the Alter Globalization movement, is their tendency to abandon traditional forms of organization and claim making in favor of what is commonly described as prefigurative politics. Instead of simply appealing for politicians to advance social change through legislation and government action, prefigurative activists work to directly establish the institutions and practices that prefigure the way society should be. Central to these institutions is their focus on eliminating power hierarchies and calling for the diffusion of power horizontally across the movement. The main principle of these prefigurative tactics is that the ends of the movement come to be reflected in the means it uses to carry them out. So to use a more succinct definition, prefigurative politics is a political orientation based on the premise that the ends of a social movement achieves are fundamentally shaped by the means it employs, and that movements should therefore do their best to choose means that embody or prefigure the kind of society they want to bring about. Now, the notion of prefigurative politics itself is not new. Its origins is commonly attributed to political theorist Karl Boggs, who coined the term in his critique of Marxist revolutionary strategies, particularly of Leninist statism, and of liberal tactics of structural reforms. Specifically, Boggs argued that these tactics rely on authoritarian and capitalist logic to organize the socialist revolution. These tactics, quote, undercut any commitment to grassroots struggle, workers' control, and cultural transformation, and detach the party from everyday life, thereby perpetuating the division between politics and economics. As a result, these tactics, Boggs argued, simply replicate and recreate the logic of capitalism itself. The solution for him was what he termed prefigurative politics, a tradition he dates back to the 19th century anarchist tradition of direct action, but that also describes some aspects of the 1960s and 1970s New Left. The term has proved quite useful. As sociologist Darcy Leach argued, many movements from the 1960s to this day have had a stable prefigurative tendency or a prefigurative wing, where activists work to embody in the present the utopian future that the movement aimed to create. Useful examples that we can find in the literature include establishing forms of participatory democracy in the student movement, adoption of alternative lifestyles in the commune movement, the creation of self-sustainable encampments in the anti-nuclear protest movement, and the adoption of non-authoritative education in the free school movement, to connect it to Itai's presentation. Today, prefigurative political forms are commonly documented in contemporary protest movements such as the uprising against neoliberal globalization and the Occupy movement. Interestingly, these movements have been often criticized for failing to articulate a clear ideological vision and political demands. In the press, members of Occupy were often challenged for not having a clear demand that they can all agree on. Students of the Alter Globalization movement also noticed that the movement created a unique coalition between movements with various different goals that didn't share common vision of an ideal future society. The movement was described as a movement of movements that brought together environmental activists, feminist activists, worker unions, and even religious organizations, who often had very different political agendas. As some scholars argued, rather than coming together around a shared political vision, collective solidarity in these movements grew out of the sharing of certain practices that offered immediate gratification. Some scholars went even further and described this as a tactical advantage. Keeping the society of the future an open question, they argued, allowed activists to form ad hoc coalitions that bring together diverse groups with diverse styles, tactics, and even goals. But here also lies the puzzle. If in prefigurative politics, the ends and means are one and the same, how can we explain the fact that movements with distinct and even contradicting political ends come to adopt the same means? Now, in an attempt to solve this puzzle, some students of prefigurative movements suggested that these movements are in fact post-ideological. Scholars like David Graeber and Marian Muckelberg argued that prefigurative movements rely on anarchist traditions that reject overarching ideological structures because the binding image of the ideal society that they propose is itself oppressive and authoritarian. Instead, these movements focus on an ethical discourse about practice. By that, these movements' prefigurative practices are their de facto ideology. This post-ideological essence may seem like these movements lack a coherent, unified goal, but in fact, it allows them to bring together people with varying political views to concentrate around shared practices. Now, in the time that I have left, I wish to argue that this post-ideological explanation is unsatisfying. As I'm going to argue, prefigurative practices are not post-ideological, but rather carry deep ideological meaning and justifications that shape them and orient them towards some image of an ideal society. These meanings serve to limit the range of actions available within prefigurative practices, making the ideology function as a mechanism for coordination and social control. I came to this conclusion after spending 4 years of participant observation with a prefigurative movement of right-wing libertarians in New England. The movement, called the Free State Project, is composed of approximately 5,000 libertarians who migrated to New Hampshire in an attempt to consolidate political power and eventually radically reform the state in a libertarian image. In order to explore the presence and importance of ideology, I decided to focus my analysis on its emergence in two types of prefigurative practices: self-sustainability and child-rearing. In both of these practices, prefigurative activists try to reshape basic institutions of living to eliminate hierarchies and power relations. In self-sustainability practices, this is done by turning away from relying on big corporations and government and supplying one's own produce and energy. In child-rearing, this is done by redefining the power relations between adults and children, so as to raise a new generation that is independent, happy, and free. The reason I focus on these two practices is precisely because they are so mundane. Child-rearing and self-sustainability practices are performed daily and have a tendency to become habitual. As such, we can expect them to be less marked by ideological convictions and than traditional political activities such as political rallies or decision-making processes. Therefore, it is by observing how ideology creeps in and shapes these practices that I can best demonstrate its overarching presence in prefigurative movements. I rely here on pragmatist logic of action, and I would be happy to expand on it if someone is interested in the Q&A. So self-sustainability ventures, or agorism, as Free Staters call it, take up a significant portion of their political activism. Most of it is concentrated around agriculture, and many Free Staters, particularly those who live in more rural towns, invest much time cultivating elaborate gardens that allow them to produce their own food and trade it with others in the community, turning their homes into small farm ventures. Such practices were also very common in historical prefigurative movements that were mostly motivated by an ecological agenda and an attempt to abolish the dependency on industrial farming and colonialism. However, when Free Staters explain the logic behind their self-sustainability ventures, they provide a very different explanation. Being a right-wing libertarian movement, when they explain their decision to turn it into farming, Free Staters commonly give three types of explanations. First, growing your own produce allows you to avoid government, specifically the Department of Agriculture regulations, thereby proving that these regulations are unnecessary. Second, trading or bartering your own produce within the community allows you to avoid paying taxes over it, thereby not funding the government. And finally, growing good product and trading it in the community without government intervention shows that a truly free market actually works, and they can then use this as a rhetorical tool when being challenged about their ideology. See, for example, this quote by Steve, who's a micro pig farmer who lives in the south of the state. Whenever you do this, there's always somebody sitting in the sidelines saying, oh, well, you took 1 watt of power from the government, so therefore you need the goddamn government. If you took a pistachio, a penny, 1 quart of dirt from the government, then by God, you need us. And why are you such an asshole about the whole government intervention? But if you can go off the grid, if you can provide your own electricity with a panel that you paid for, if you can provide your own food with a pig you've grown, then at some point or another, these people are stopped in their narrative. And so for me, that's part of it. Just to be able to show that we don't actually need you guys. You're just here providing a service in an incredibly inflated price. And the fact that you forced me to buy it doesn't mean that I need it. When I asked Steve who he has to prove this to, he told me how often he finds himself having to defend his ideology and lifestyle to people who critique or simply dismiss the movement. For him, as well as other Free Staters, the ideology doesn't only give meaning to the prefigurative practices, but it also arms them with rhetorical tools to justify their actions whenever needed. But it is not only to outsiders that Free Staters have to justify themselves. It is also to other Free Staters. When making decisions, Free Staters are occasionally criticized by other Free Staters over the way they act and carry out their prefigurative practices. In such situations, what is obvious is that Free Staters often draw on libertarian ideology to justify their actions. And to illustrate this, let's move to talk about their child-rearing practices. So Free Staters are great believers in not enforcing the wills of adults on children. As such, many parents advocate for what they term peaceful parenting, where instead of disciplining their children, parents allow their children to experiment themselves and make their own decisions, learning in the process to distinguish between right and wrong. This approach, though, is a source of great deal of debate within the community over how free children should really be to make their own mistakes. Thus, in a peaceful parenting workshop that I attended that took place in one of the community's events, the instructor explained that it is okay to limit a child's choice in some circumstances. For example, if they want to eat junk food because it is unhealthy for them. This raised protests by some of the participants who saw this as imposing the will of the parent on the child. They saw this as oppressive. In response, the instructor argued that this is necessary because children are particularly susceptible to advertisement and cannot be trusted to know what is good for them. She then immediately added that eating toxic food makes your body fall apart on you. And as you grow up, you become dependent on government programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, effectively making you a ward of the state. What is interesting here is that simply arguing on account of the child's health was not enough. In order to justify her decision, the instructor had to draw on libertarian ideology of rejection of government welfare. By that, libertarian ideology doesn't only give meaning to prefigurative practices, it also defines the vocabulary of motive that people can use to justify their actions. This makes ideology function as a form of social control over what people can and cannot justify, and as a result, on what people can and cannot do. So to conclude, prefigurative practices are not post-ideological, but rather carry ideological meanings that shape not only what activists hope to achieve by them, but also limit their ability to justify certain practices and thereby shape the practices themselves. This suggests that prefigurative movements may not be as post-ideological as has been suggested. If this is true, further research is needed to explain the emergence of inter-ideological collaboration in contemporary prefigurative movement, ones that focus on how people are able to collaborate despite their ideological differences and not assume that these are simply eliminated. Thank you very much.